Hey guys, it's Jenny Silver, and today I want to talk to those of you who are being hit with an overpayment from the California EDD. Many of you are wondering, what exactly is the overpayment penalty? What happens if you do not respond or do not pay the EDD? And can an EDD overpayment affect other areas such as your work, immigration status, wages, etc.? To get expert information, I have spoken with Asaf Liktosh from Pershing Square Law Firm. This video is sponsored by Pershing Square Law Firm. Pershing Square Law Firm is California's first and only law firm dedicated to EDD law. They represent clients in appealing any kind of adverse decision made by the EDD. Whether it is a denial of benefits, overpayments, procedural, or computational issues with your claim, they represent claimants undergoing any of these issues. In the 8 years they have been in business, they have maintained an A+ rating and accreditation from the Better Business Bureau. They offer a flat rate fee and do not operate on percentages, so claimants keep almost all of their benefits. Pershing Square Law Firm understands that their clients are undergoing financial hardship, and therefore their pricing is intended to be very accessible to most people, even those undergoing such financial hardship. Lastly, they offer a complimentary consultation, and anyone facing legal issues with the EDD can call into Pershing Square Law Firm and receive helpful information and get questions answered directly from an attorney through a free consultation. Click on the link in the video description in order to contact Pershing Square Law Firm. I think that many people are facing overpayments. They may, in fact, have actually provided a false statement. They may have knowingly or unknowingly entered something incorrectly. They may have repercussions now that they have to pay benefits back, and they are subject to those overpayments and they won't be waived. What is the worst case scenario for this? How far does this stretch? Because many claimants are worried not only about monetary concerns, but what happens if they don't pay it back? How bad can the penalties be? Can it affect things like their immigration status? Can they have jail time required of them? How far can this actually go?
Worst case scenario, unfortunately, can be really, really bad, but it's rare. Of all the people we've dealt with, and we've dealt with literally thousands of people over the course of the pandemic, I've not seen a single case, and there have been so many overpayments. I've not seen a single case where someone ended up with any kind of legal action taken against them for fraud or some criminal allegations or anything of that sort. So I think that is one thing to take into consideration. To put it into proportion, it is a serious matter because there are consequences to providing false information to the EDD or omitting important information that's causing them to pay you benefits you're not supposed to receive. I think primarily the consequences are financial. You're going to have to pay back this money. You're going to have to pay a 30% penalty. You can pretty much forget about unemployment for the foreseeable future. There's like I said, a 15-week penalty that's probably going to stay there for 3 years. So if you want to file for benefits again in the next 3 years, you're going to have to wait through those 15 weeks. I think the worst part of it is that the EDD is very aggressive in collecting money from people. They will levy your bank account. They'll garnish your wages. They'll take away your tax return money. They'll take away your lottery winnings. They'll pretty much find every way possible to get that money back. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that if you don't pay, because the interest is so high, it's a self-perpetuating debt. So I've seen people who from year to year just let the EDD take away their tax return. But by the time they've reached the next tax return season, the amount they've already paid has been replenished by the interest. So they're just in this endless cycle where they just give up their tax return in perpetuity to the EDD. So I don't know if it's set up to be this way, but it's completely crazy and evil, if you ask me, to keep people in this perpetual payment posture. But I think the takeaway is you don't want to put yourself in this position, and you want to use every tool you have available to you if you find yourself in this position to get out. The best thing you can do is, of course, appeal as quickly as possible, not let this sit and fester. I think another way that you could sort of manage the situation is, even if you have an overpayment that you disagree with, unless you're filing a timely appeal, which should be resolved within a few weeks, just pay off as much as you can, or find someone else to owe the money to, because the interest is a killer. It will literally keep you owing money to them for a very long time, or you might end up with double the amount if you just let it sit there for years.
So it's a 30% fee, and then I believe you said 10% interest.
10% per year interest, yes, on top of everything. So 10% goes for the principal and for the penalty.
So does the EDD ever assess the overpayment and require that, but waive the penalty or the interest?
I've never seen them waive an interest before. That's never happened. What I have seen them do is they're not going to waive the penalty, but you can fight the penalty by appealing the false statement. So just because you were overpaid doesn't mean that you shouldn't appeal. Right? It's possible that you'll find yourself in a situation where you agree with the overpayment, but you don't agree with the false statement. Appeal. Because if you get rid of the false statement, three things are going to happen. Number one, you'll get rid of the 30% penalty. Number two, you will get rid of whatever weeks of unemployment benefits that they took away from you, which you can use to offset your overpayment. And number three, it'll cause the debt to be subject to a statute of limitations. Not so when you have a false statement. If you have a false statement, it can go on in perpetuity. And if you remove the false statement, there's a statute of limitations. I believe it's 1 year. And if the EDD doesn't go to court and get a judgment against you within that 1 year, then you are off the hook and you should be able to remove it. The problem is that removing it requires filing an appeal. And if you're going to file an appeal after 1 year, it's not going to be a timely appeal. Obviously, the better thing to do is just to file an appeal as quickly as possible. But if you find yourself in a situation where you're dealing with an older overpayment and doesn't have a false statement, you can file an appeal to get rid of it through the statute of limitations. And you definitely have a strong incentive to fight the false statement, to get rid of the penalties and the statute of limitation to be applied to the debt itself.
So how could this potentially affect immigration status and any other factors that could be affected by this?
So false statement could potentially affect your immigration status and could affect your application for a job. If the job requires you to have some kind of a background check, like for example, federal jobs as a police officer, as a teacher, things where you're entrusted with, let's say, the safety of other people. One example, when you apply for an immigration status in the United States, one of the questions that are posed to you is whether or not you ever provided false information to a government entity. And if you have a false statement against you by the EDD that you've not reversed, if you are going to answer truthfully, the answer will have to be yes. That might complicate things for you. So you want to take that into consideration. With that being said, it's not necessarily going to trigger any flags or any kind of action with the immigration authorities in the United States. They're not necessarily talking to each other, but you have to keep in mind that this is all public record. And this is all part of the government's system, and this might be accessible to them in the future. And providing false information on your immigration application is not a good idea. So the best thing you could do is, if you are going through or plan to go through an immigration process and you are subject to a false statement, fight it as quickly as you can. With regard to your application for different kinds of jobs, we've seen police officers, people who are looking for some kind of an advancement through a government system, and teachers could have been potentially affected by a false statement unless they had gone through an appeal and reversed it. When you go through the process of being hired for one of these positions, you may be posed a question about whether you ever provided false information to a government entity. And again, your answer would have to be yes.
So now what about an accidental false statement? Does that exist? Will EDD qualify something as a false statement if it was submitted accidentally, if someone either didn't know the full extent of their information? For example, if a claimant is filling out their unemployment application back in 2020, they're self-employed, they may not have known their exact net income because they didn't have careful record keeping. Perhaps they didn't file taxes. If they submitted that information and realized later on that it was not correct, would that be a false statement? What would your advice be with that?
That's an excellent question. The answer is, if you should have known, or through the exercise of ordinary caution and diligence, could have provided the right and complete information to the EDD, even though it didn't happen intentionally, but through just your extraordinary negligence, right? Gross negligence, not ordinary negligence, something that is beyond. Let me give you an example. A lot of overpayments occurred when people fail to report accurate information about their earnings. And then they have this situation where they've received benefits and wages at the same time. So we've come across a situation where a person did report, but they reported inaccurately. They just gave a kind of sort of estimate of how much money they were making. At the hearing, the judge asks them, okay, so why didn't you just report what you saw in your pay stub? And they said, well, I didn't know. Some basically explanation that implies ordinary negligence. But the judge wouldn't have it. And she determined that because the person had pay stubs, and because question number 6 specifically asked, did you earn any money, whether you're paid or not? And then it gave him a specific request to enter an accurate amount of earnings. And they didn't provide that accurate information, even though it was available to them, then they were grossly negligent. Okay, so even though this person, I would say, wasn't acting with malice or wasn't trying to steal money from the EDD, I think that is probably the lowest threshold. Okay, but with that being said, you are not going to be found to have made a false statement, or if you have been found to have made a false statement for making an honest mistake, then that's reversible. An honest mistake is not a false statement, but it's going to be incumbent on you to prove that. You bear the burden of showing that it was an honest mistake, and you have to walk through the mechanism of the mistake, and no one's going to let you off easy. It's a very hard inquiry, and you have to be ready to answer and explain and get the judge into your brain why this mistake happened. Why did you fill out the form this way, not the other way? But I think the takeaway is you don't want to push yourself in this position, and you want to use every tool you have available to you if you find yourself in this position to get out. The best thing you can do is, of course, appeal as quickly as possible, not let this sit and fester.